Live from the SABC's Auckland Park headquarters, welcome to this week's first edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko. On the show tonight,
never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement.
With the Freedom Month themes we started last week, looking back at progress made or not made in the past 28 years since South Africa became a democracy. This evening we look at the National Development Plan, almost 10 years after it was adopted by Parliament. Why is the country's blueprint failing? That's what we're exploring with the Deputy Chairperson of the National Planning Commission. And another conference weekend, another peculiar election outcome. What does it all mean for the ANC's much-touted renewal and its ability to self-correct? We look at the results of the past couple of weeks where elections or electoral conferences were held, and look at the state of the governing party. The Watchdog starts now. Well, by the admission of those entrusted with its implementation, they today held a briefing to talk to the media about the National Development Plan, how things are going there. The Commission saying its priority going forward is implementation. It says the country is unlikely to meet its developmental goals as set out in the National Development Plan because of poor implementation, among other things. The Commission says it will focus on supporting leaders to accelerate the implementation of the NDP by 2030.
The National Planning Commission says the major findings of the NDP review was that implementation of the NDP has been weak and that there has been little remedial action to correct the shortcomings. It says poor implementation record was worsened by the impact of COVID-19, further moving the country away from its targets. It says its priority is getting implementation on track.
One of the most urgent tasks facing the third NPC is that of facilitating a return to course. In recentering the NDP as the main developmental plan of the country, we will work towards a realignment and a cohering of all key national plans, such as the MTSF and the Spatial Planning Framework, so that these revolve around the developmental priorities as set out in the National Development Plan.
The Commission says the challenges facing the country at the moment include the impact of COVID-19, slow economic growth, rising poverty, inequality, corruption and crime.
One of the shortcomings that they identified through this discussion was the incapacity of the state to implement the proposals of the NDP. This often combined with poor leadership that pay lip service to the NDP without understanding its scope has acted as an obstacle to implementation of the developmental objectives. As government, we are clear that the greatest challenge has been around implementation, and in the discussions held to date, this was my emphasis, and collectively together with yourselves.
The National Planning Commission says it will use its time to support leadership to build a capable state and encourage active citizenry to eliminate poverty and reduce unemployment and inequality. Gloria Sefakomosi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Professor Dinyego Maluleke, the Deputy Chairperson of the National Planning Commission, joins us on the line. Prof, it's a pity, again, technology is not playing ball. Hopefully, we will be able to sort that out during the course of this conversation. But we'll have to continue on the telephone line for now. You know, I mean, a couple of things that stood out for me, and they came from your own input, you know, during that conversation you were having with journalists. I mean, South Africa unlikely to meet its national development goals as encapsulated in the plan. You were saying that the implementation is weak, and something that should be of concern, I think, to many South Africans is what you said about the fact that there has been very little remedial action to actually address the implementation shortcomings that have been identified.
Yes, Vuyo. I would love to say that I have made those discoveries by myself, but actually what I said is not new. It is something that the President himself has said before. It is something that members of Cabinet have observed. It certainly is something that the previous National Planning Commission has zoned in on in their handover reports to us, but also in the NDP review that they commissioned in 2020. So it's not rocket science. I think that ordinary South Africans know that many of the big goals of the NDP have not been achieved, and we are nowhere near achieving them now that we are 8 years from 2030. What is that at least we know how far off target we are. We have a plan, and we can track our progress against that plan as a country. And we can correct this. And I'm convinced that given the caliber of men and women who are in the third National Planning Commission, wonderful, amazing, patriotic South Africans with skills in different areas, a multidisciplinary team. I think that that team gives me hope. And also the power that we have as a National Planning Commission, the power to convene government, the power to assist government in thinking around implementation, and of course to engage them and make them accountable for failure to implement are some of the powers that we're going to try and use.
Well, I mean, the question, Prof, is, I mean, we've been told this before. Yes, you may well be the third group to have assumed this responsibility, but from the word go, we're told that there were these wonderful, capable, patriotic South Africans who had taken charge of this process. So, I mean, how many times are we going to hear that?
Look, yeah, I together with my fellow commissioners, understand and appreciate the exasperation and the impatience of South Africans with the implementation of the NDP and with the slow economic growth in general. So it's not enough simply to say that we have a good commission, just like it hasn't been enough to say we have a good plan, because unless the plan is implemented, then people do not feel the difference. I think we must also point out to the few things that have been achieved since the National Development Plan has been put forward. For example, I work in a sector in higher education which has doubled the numbers of students over the past 10 or so years. And I also know that while we may not guarantee anything, we are able now, through the state coffers, to assist more students to study than we were before. Again, it is this plan is contained, or rather this goal is contained in the NDP. There's a tax incentive scheme that is touted in the NDP, meant to assist first-time entrants into the workplace, especially young people who come in without experience. And that has also been implemented successfully. Some, of course, of our successes are double-edged swords. I mean, if you look at the numbers of people that are receiving grants, for example, which has been a major weapon of the country against poverty and starvation, that number has increased over the years. But of course, do we want that number to keep growing, or would we rather create a capable state as well as a capable citizenry? So it's not merely the goodwill of government or members of the National Commission that will take us forward. It is our ability to really hold one another to account and to keep the National Development Plan at the center of all planning in the country.
Okay, I hear you, Prof, about the successes, one of which has been happening, as you say, in your own sector. So you're very familiar with developments there. But overall, you were bold enough, and so did the minister, to say, as you have just reiterated it here in your in the first things you said, that we are not meeting the targets, and in your own words, we are nowhere near meeting those targets. And here's my point. When you talk about the reasons, when you talk about the shortcomings as they have been identified by the National Planning Commission in the conversations you've had among yourselves from the time you were appointed, I mean, incapacity of the state. Remember, there's been conversations here, I mean, among the last people to talk about, the dangers of a failed state is the outgoing Director General at Treasury. So you talk about the incapacity of the state to implement the proposals of the National Development Plan. The minister in the presidency spoke also about combined poor leadership that pays lip service, as you have put it, to the National Development Plan, and people who don't understand the goals of the National Development Plan. Even scarier, you talk about leadership that has acted as an obstacle to implementation of developmental priorities. And I'm saying here that just on those three things or areas alone, what is scary is that the people who have been entrusted with the responsibilities of implementing these plans are the ones who know nothing, pay lip service, and if my reading of what you said today is correct, have a devil-may-care attitude.
Yeah, look, one of the main functions of the National Planning Commission is to tell the truth to South Africans, to be forthright, to explain what is working and what is not working. We can't do less than that. If we were to fail to paint as authentic and as truthful a picture as possible, we would be failing in our first task. Right from our first meeting, the president told us, you need to be honest with us and you need to be honest with South Africans. It is from that point of view that we speak about the failings of implementation that we have referred to. The reasons for failure are, in our view, something a little bit more complex than the anecdotal kind of explanation one often finds. So people say we have failed to implement because of the absence of a capable state. And that is true, but I think it is something that needs to be nuanced, because what do we mean by a capable state? What are the elements that will make the state capable? But we also need to look at issues of coordination and coherence. So there is an extent to which failure to implement is sometimes a function of incoherence between the various plans and the various implementation sites. So from local government to provincial government to national government to the MTSF, for example, the level of resonance between the MTSF and the National Development Plan needs to be improved. So those are some of the things, and of course the prioritization. What comes first in order for other things to happen?
I'm glad, Prof. You've just mentioned a coordination and a coherence, because the president, whose baby the NDP is, right, is sitting with performance agreements that he entered into with his cabinet ministers. The minister in the presidency, who is the chairperson of the National Planning Commission, and the two of you addressed the media briefing today, is responsible for planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Now, if we just take those two things, just those two things, and I'm speaking here to you as the deputy chairperson of the National Planning Commission, and your commission has the advantage, you said a little earlier, that you can actually convene a government, and the president has said, be brutal with us. You know, have you been able to sort of to touch on those areas, for example, to say, what do you have to show for putting into place a system that allows you to performance manage your ministers, to ensure that they know what is expected of them in their respective portfolio? Has the department responsible for monitoring, evaluation, been doing that? Because we wouldn't be surprised at the end of a 10-year period that things are not going to plan. There would have been an early warning system. People who have been familiar, you know, with the issues, and they would be able to say beforehand that, look, guys, we are not going to be able to meet our targets, and that would not have been discovered towards the end of a 10-year period, let alone do something about it.
Yes. So we have 60 months in which to be this body that is an advisory think tank, you know, that advises the president and the cabinet. Of those 60 months, we have already spent 5. So in many ways, our task has only just begun. We can't speak as if we have been here for a year or a year and a half. We have hardly been around for 6 months as a new planning commission. But what I can assure you is that already in the few engagements that we have had among ourselves, that we have had with the minister in the presidency, that we have had with the president, we have been very forthright about the need to unlock and unblock the implementation logjam. So we have been very honest with government until now. Our job is, of course, also that of conducting research and impact studies and creating knowledge around the problems of implementation and making sure that by the time our term ends, there has been a marked improvement in the speed and intensity of implementation. But it is early days. All I can say is that we are poised as a new national commission to make a difference.
Well, we can only hope you do, indeed, Prof. And hopefully you won't fall into the same trap of the previous ones. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, who is the Deputy Chairperson of the National Planning Commission. Today, they had a media briefing where they spoke about progress or lack of progress over the past 9 or so years. And we're talking about also their commitment to ensuring that they turn things around. But as you have just heard him, it looks unlikely at this stage that as a country we will be able to meet our national development goals as they were encapsulated or are encapsulated in the National Development Plan. With that plan coming, of course, we're approaching 10 years of that plan, but from what they have seen, we're nowhere near meeting those goals. Hopefully the situation is going to indeed turn around. Those patriotic, capable men and women that Professor Maluleke was talking about will turn the tide. After the break, the outcomes of ANC conferences so far and whether they are telling us anything about the party's ultimate direction. That conversation in a moment. Well, another conference weekend for the ANC, another rather peculiar election outcome. You would have seen that eThekwini, the former mayor, was elected chairperson of eThekwini region, something that has got many South Africans talking. But what does this all mean on the back of that outcome in Mpumalanga last week, where the treasurer or the incoming treasurer of the ANC in that province is someone who too has had to step aside, but that didn't stop his comrades from electing him treasurer of the ANC in that province, in the same way that the party faithful in eThekwini found nothing wrong with electing Umam Zandile as the chairperson for eThekwini region. Is this telling us anything about the ANC's renewal and its ability to self-correct? Well, let's speak to our panel of analysts, Beki Mngomezulu, as well as Ongama Mtimka. Gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for your time. I don't know what you make. I'll leave it up to you to tell our viewers just what you made of the outcomes of both big conferences that took place this past weekend and the previous one. Ongama?
Good evening to you, Vuyo, and your viewers. Thank you for having me this evening. So there's nothing surprising here. What the ANC failed to do in order to make sure that it implements the resolution, I think it's 9R, in the under fighting crime and corruption in the NASREC resolutions, which in fact was the affirmation of the NGC resolutions, was first to drop the bar as far in terms of what the requirement is. The resolution is very clear that it's dealing with people that are accused of corruption, and it is silent on the issue of whether or not they have been formally charged. So my view is that, and then if you look at the constitution of the party itself on Rule 25 in acts of misconduct, it has a wide range of issues which are regarded as acts of misconduct that, which when members do, they bring the organization into disrepute. So I've always argued that when the party, in interpreting the implications of this, came up with the issue of somebody being formally charged, it dropped the bar. That's fine. And also, what it needed to do was to then come up with criteria for nomination and vetting of candidates for leadership positions. Because if you come up with a law that says, a rule that says somebody should step aside from their position, it automatically follows, as far as I'm concerned, that there should be qualifying criteria, even for being elected into office. Because if you can compel somebody to step aside on the basis of a rule around integrity, that should automatically become part of the qualifying criteria before voting and nomination is accepted. To say, equally, people who are accused of corruption or acts of misconduct should actually be disqualified from participating in leadership structures or being nominated for leadership, because it's a waste of organization time. But also, if you look at earlier rules within the ANC through the eye of the needle, you had the framework even there for a particular kind of caliber of leaders that are desirable. It's affirmed in every organizational renewal conference since the the Gqeberha conference in 2000, to actually have a particular caliber of people who lead the party and people who of good moral standing and virtue. So to have failed to institute qualifying criteria for leadership results in, throughout the country, and in not just these two cases, but throughout the country, to have people who have been accused of corruption. Some charges have been dropped because of lack of evidence, but the prima facie evidence that was there points to the potential guilt of these people. So if those charges were to come in future, they would not stand the test of time and would need to step aside. And in fact, there's a parting shot on this point. Communities where leaders come from know of shenanigans that are reported through community communication platforms, and it is they that have resulted in the ANC being rejected by communities. So voters, when they vote, do not operate the same way that the party has attempted to operate, where it uses principles of legality. Voters actually use principles of morality and ethics. So the ANC has shot itself in the foot here by dropping the bar too low and failing to come up to use the very same rationale for stepping aside as qualifying criteria for standing for office.
Peggy Mohamed Zulu, it was interesting for me among the first things Umamukumede had to say after her victory at the weekend was that this step aside rule should actually be looked at again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mbogo, for having me in this program. You know what, there are a number of interesting things in as far as the step-aside resolution of the ANC is concerned. From where I'm standing, I'm of the view that the resolution was taken in a rush. And I'm saying this because you have seen or you've heard conflicting messages, even from the senior leadership of the organization. My colleague there has just referred to the two cases in Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal. And interestingly, both of us have been following the proceedings closely because we had vested interest to see what's going to happen. And given that we also have to write about these things, and therefore we have to know exactly what's happening. Interestingly, when it comes to the Mpumalanga case, we saw that Mandla Msebi, in fact, was nominated and then subsequently elected as the treasurer of the ANC in that province. And then immediately thereafter, the ANC wrote him a letter saying that he must step aside. So the questions that my colleague is asking, they are very critical questions, because if indeed he was on a step aside, why then did he avail himself, and then why was he elected? And then, of course, the ANC comes back and says, no, seemingly, even the so-called serious allegations, there is no clear definition of what is meant by that. So that is why then I'm saying that this particular resolution was taken in a rush. You can understand, of course, because in 2017, there was a lot of excitement. I always say that when you take a resolution based either on excitement or anger, you run the risk of, in fact, getting the opposite of what you wanted to achieve, because both of them have a short lifespan. Anger is a short lifespan, and of course, excitement is a short lifespan. Coming back to your question and the comment by Umamzandile Kumete that this resolution should be put aside, I'm on record making the same call, saying that on the one hand, you have the step-aside resolution which is being implemented, and there is even a view that is not implemented evenly or consistently. And then on the other hand, you have the renewal agenda. The question then becomes, if you juxtapose the two positions, how do you rebuild an organization while at the same time you have divisions that are caused by the step-aside resolution? And then how do you implement the step-aside resolution if you yourself, as the implementers, don't understand it the same way? You heard what Minister Natim Tetwa said after the Mpumalanga conference, saying that Mpumalanga province doesn't necessarily have to do anything because Mandla Msebi was already on a step aside. Immediately thereafter, you heard the Treasurer General of the ANC saying that in fact, it's not clear what is meant by serious allegations. Remember that if you compare the two, if you juxtapose, let's say, Zandile Kumete on the one hand, and then Mandla Msebi on the other hand. I was talking to some of your colleagues earlier today and yesterday, saying that if I'm accused of theft, and then you are accused of murder, which one of the two has more weight? And then you go back to the resolution and try to establish what is meant by serious allegations and who has to make the determination. So I think it's in that context that if the resolution is not helping you, why do you continue implementing it? Put it aside, think it through, and then come up with a clear agenda. At the moment, it's confusing and it's divisive.
But Ongama, you say that the resolution is actually very clear, you know, but it was the ANC that subsequently lowered the bar, you know, as you put it. In other words, what we're seeing now is a watered down version of what the resolution said, with all its flaws, like it being silent on certain aspects of this. Do you think that the ANC sort of felt the need to be seen to be doing something when in reality it actually wasn't doing anything?
Absolutely spot on, Vuyo. So the ANC has been trapped in this, facade and make-believe politics, where it acts left and it talks left and acts right on questions of morality. There's no ambiguity in the literature of the party on what constitutes ethical leadership, or what constitutes the ideal leaders of the movement. So if you look at throughout history, that question is very clear in terms of the practice of electing leaders in the party throughout its history. It's always been people who were inspirational and of high repute. And then in the democratic period, as an attempt to try and deal with what it calls new tendencies, there has been, from conference after conference, attempts to define a cadership of the ANC that is ideal for office. So there is no ambiguity as far as what constitutes the ideal is concerned. The ambiguity is not even there if you read the entire Rule 25 of the ANC Constitution on acts of misconduct. That's why I was expecting, when initially the process of the Integrity Commission coming up with rules for the implementing the step-aside resolution, I first thought that what they were going to do were going to interpret Rule 25 and actually come up with criteria with weights on what are the key elements of acts of misconduct. It's defined in its own constitution. So all that needed to be made in the rule-making process that the Integrity Commission was involved in, and some from the NEC, was to craft, to give some substance to those terms. What are the and all it would take really would be discussions within the NEC as to what weight should be given, for example, to people who are accused and have not yet been charged, to people who have been charged, to people who communities do not support as ward councillors because of allegations of criminality or corruption, or even things like nepotism, which is written in the constitution of the ANC. So all of those things could have been built up to come up with criteria for, one, selecting people for leadership, and then two, for compelling people who had otherwise been clean at the time of being elected to step aside when they fall from grace. So I agree that, in fact, what I think is happening is that the factions within the ANC have become bigger than the party. And this is not news. This is something that's been the case now for 10 years. In terms of this, you have one group that lobbies for returning to the values of the ANC. And I'm choosing not to say which group that is, because if you look at the current makeup of factions, it's very difficult to tell which group is for what, beyond the make-believe framing that each of the groups present about themselves. So you have some people who present themselves as reformists and are agitating for a values-based party, and then you've got people who are blatantly anti-rule of law and anti-ethical agenda, and are bent on actually having people who are compromised to lead the party. And that's precisely because many of them, and in fact across the factional divide, you've got people who are accused of corruption and people who have been fired from municipalities, all to find that they get redeployed to provincial legislatures or the National Assembly. Precisely because of this, the party can never redeem itself. It's in a situation where even membership or the administration of conferences will not be done to the extent that it neutralizes the power of power brokers and brings power ultimately to the branches. So it's an entire kleptocratic system that is premised not on merit and performance, where you find that good leaders are rewarded. Throughout the country, you've got good leaders, good former speakers, good former mayors who are on the sidelines of the party, despite the fact that they were among some of the most excellent of its cadres. And the reason why that is so, it's because in order to survive within the ANC and remain in office, you've got to belong to a power bloc rather than do your job. So we're talking now about renewal around the issue of integrity. We've not even touched the issue of deploying people who are fit for purpose and are capable. And the reason why the party can never get there is precisely because its structure of campaigning for office is not based on humility in relation to the power that ordinary people have. It's based on strong men politics or strong women politics of coordinators and gatekeepers who actually manufacture conference outcomes rather than humble themselves to the will of the people, and precisely because of that need to depend on the people, perform well once in office.
One wonders, Begum Gemuzulu, I mean, just to what extent things like the step-aside rules are made to be, an end themselves, when in fact they are supposed to, help the party or the organization move in that recognizable, ethical, and you can say all the good words that that are supposed to follow, and one talks about that. And I'm saying this, or I'm asking this question, not oblivious to the fact that the mills of the law or our state law enforcement agencies tend to grind very, very, very slowly, and this has been a complaint that many people have been using to say, all that needs to happen is I have to be accused of something, and that's the end of me. And they've been using that to push back against such things as the step aside rule.
You know what, Will? There is an issue that we need to talk to. I'm glad that my colleague is referring to the ANC's constitution and then putting it against the step-aside resolution. Because under normal circumstances, we say that the constitution of the country is the supreme law of the country, which means that whether you're talking about a political party's constitution or a church constitution or any other structure for that matter, it has to abide by the national constitution. It can't be in contravention of the national constitution. So that is the point of departure. And then your question is whether this step-aside rule is an end in itself. Before we answer that question, let's ask ourselves another question. How did we get here? In other words, why and how was this step-aside resolution conceptualized in the first instance? The simple answer to that is that the ANC did self-introspection, and then it came to the conclusion that the kind of leaders that my colleague is referring to, your ideal leaders, are now in short supply. And then to make sure that the few that are remaining get into positions and lead society, let us eliminate those who are tainted or those whose political image has been dented. But then for you to do that, you needed to do what my colleague is referring to. You needed to look at what the constitution of the party says. Of course, the assumption is that the constitution of the party is not in contravention of the constitution of the country. And then having assessed that and made a determination, you then look at the specific clauses. One case in point is this section 25, which you normally refer to, which in fact led Esma Khashoggi leaving the party. So in fact being suspended from the party. So you look at the section 25 and then you draw from it certain clauses and sections that are going to assist you in formulating the step-aside rule. But this did not happen. And I'm glad that my colleague is agreeing with me that this did not happen. Because had the ANC done that, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about the step-aside resolution, which is hard to implement. In fact, it's impractical because at one point you get a sense that it's implemented where it suits certain people and it's not implemented in other instances. I made some examples a couple of weeks ago saying that under normal circumstances, when you had allegations against the former speaker, who is now the Minister of Defense, one would have expected that they would have applied the same principle, but they didn't. And then they tried to go back to interpret and reinterpret the step-aside resolution, and they said, no, our conclusion is that she doesn't deserve to step aside. You had similar instances with the Premier of the Eastern Cape, Honorable Oscar Mabuyane. They had to go back and try to find certain clauses and see if in fact he qualifies to step aside or he shouldn't. So the reason why you have to second guess what is happening is because there is no clarity, full stop. Had they done the spade work, had they done what my colleague is referring to, referred to the specific clause of the Constitution of the party, Section 25 to be exact, then most of these challenges would have been attended to. But then to answer your question directly, I don't think that we can say that the step-aside resolution is a panacea to the ANC's challenges, because the step-aside resolution itself is problematic in its current state.
Ongama, I mean, does the ANC even have the ability or the capacity to do the spade work that Begi refers to?
For that,
yes,
sorry, please proceed.
So you wanted to chip in quickly, Begi?
No. I was in fact about to say that the ANC does have the ability, but does it have the political will? And to that question, I'll give an emphatic no. In other words, the ANC is able to self-correct, but at the moment, it is not in a position to do so because there is no political will to do that. The ANC has a history of self-correcting. The 1969 Morogoro Conference is one typical example where the ANC had challenges, serious challenges, and the likes of Chris Hani were vocal about certain issues which the ANC was not doing right. But because there was
isn't that part of the problem, right, Begi? Sorry,
they did it.
I'm chipping it because we have run out of time. But I'm saying, isn't that part of the problem, or a big part of the problem, if not the problem, the fact that we are able to refer to history when the material conditions nowadays are completely different? In other words, while the ANC may have been in a position to self-correct back then, it is no longer, nowhere near, in fact, that position today.
No, the ANC does have the ability. What is lacking is the political will, because you still have all the documents in place. The Constitution is there. They know exactly what needs to be done. There are people who are smart in the ANC, who are the brains of the ANC. But because some of them are frustrated, they end up taking the back seat. And then those who are vocal enough are the ones who win the day. Okay. So that is where the problem is.
Okay. So, Ongama, from your vantage point, as a last word on this?
It has some potential, definitely no ability whatsoever. And the reason why I say so is because the political context of the organization is such that it's in a debilitating, constant warring state. And as such, you cannot even have credible attempts to try and renew. In order for renewal to happen, you need at least a majority of people who are committed to the ideals. What you have currently are two broken halves, one pushing in one direction and another pushing in another direction. So what is needed for the ANC to try and renew itself is for the party to split as a pragmatic choice of the current moment. Right from the top all the way to the bottom in municipalities, the party has crippled its own capability to renew itself through a lack of reforming its electoral system to emphasize good performance and merit over creation of power blocks and gangs that mobilize in order to keep each other in power. As long as in my view, is that that's a fatal flaw in the system, and it cannot be corrected unless it splits.
And that's where we're going to leave it for this evening. Thanks to both of you for coming through an interesting conversation. I so wish we had more time, but unfortunately we don't. And that's how we come to the end of tonight's program. To join us again tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. sharp. Good night.